As was said on Sunday, during our time away, we were invited to present at a universal peace celebration held at a center of love and light in the Swiss Alps. And on the second day, the stories were told, after which a statement was made that caused a kind of stunned silence, with the effect that on the third day hardly anyone came to the story telling. But that statement was, the force of love and light creates our realities and our experiences, but all the laws of life work for emptiness. So this brings a question for us, a valid question. What is it that we experience when we find ourselves in the place where the onion has been, where all of its layers have been removed, and we find ourselves in the space where the onion has been? There's a reminder of an old story, and several stories have already been told that point to this, of all persuasions, Taoist, Zen, Buddhist. And it's the story about the great being, the Bal Shem Tov. And one day he called 3 of his hasidim and said to them, "We have a task to undertake." And so they climbed into his carriage, and in what seemed to be just the blink of an eye, they found themselves in a far distant place, a far distant town, at the doorway to a house of a Jewish family who were in the midst of a celebration, because the next day their recently born son was to undergo his bri, or his ritual circumcision. But when they entered this household, it was noticed that the man of the house, the husband, the father of the child, was sad. And so the Bal Shem Tov asked him, "What is it in the midst of this festivity, awaiting this celebratory ritual? Why are you sad?" And the man admitted, 8 times my wife has given birth to a son, and 8 times on the eve of their circumcision, they were killed. So the Bal Shem Tov said to his 3 hasidim, "This is our task. Tonight, you 3 must keep vigil by the cradle of this child. It is imperative that you do not sleep for 1 moment." And he handed to them a sack, and he said, "Hold this above the child's head and call me if something occurs." So the 3 hasidim, taking their designated task very seriously, stood at the head of the cradle, holding the sack keeping themselves awake by saying the chants and the prayers of their faith. As the night went on, even though there was no wind, all of a sudden the fire in the grate began to waver and the candles began to flicker. The candles blew out, leaving just the faint light of the embers of the fire. And in that light, as the 3 hasidim stood in vigil, they saw at the window the slit green eyes of a creature. Suddenly, with a whoosh, that creature flew in through the window, but instead of landing into the cradle of the sleeping babe, it landed into the sack which the hasidim held. With much hissing and screeching, the 3 tied the top of the sack to keep the creature captured, and they called the Bal Shem Tov. He came with his staff, and to much screaming and screeching, he beat the sack roundly, and then, opening the front door, allowed the creature to escape. The next day there was much jubilation, as it was found that the baby boy was still alive. So celebrations took place after the ritual circumcision took place. In the midst of the celebrations, a messenger came from the squire of that community, demanding the presence of the Bal Shem Tov. Now the father of the child said to him, "Please don't go. Our squire is a sorcerer. He knows magic. He can make spells." But the Bal Shem Tov insisted that he would go as he was demanded to do. So in the midst of the celebrations, he went off to the squire's house and was escorted into his chamber by his servants. And there was the squire, bandaged, battered, his face bruised, bandages around his broken ribs, a sling on his arm, and snarling at the Bal Shem Tov, he said, "You caught me by surprise. You must be a great wizard." But the Bal Shem Tov replied, "I am no wizard. I know no magic. I know no spells." But the squire replied, "I challenge you to a duel." And the Bal Shem Tov did not refuse this challenge. He said, "Let us meet tomorrow in such and such a place." And so the word was out and everyone came and gathered around to see this duel between the sorcerer and the Bal Shem Tov, and what he represented and was. Now all that the Bal Shem Tov had in his possession was his staff. And so, when the duel began, the Bal Shem Tov, standing with his staff, and the great magician, the sorcerer, pulling out from his pantheon of psychic weapons, the demons, the ghouls, the wild animals, and so forth. But each of these weapons, as they came into the aegis of the Bal Shem Tov, seemed to disappear into a veil of smoke, no longer there, no longer a reality, until finally the sorcerer, the squire, completely depleted his supply of psychic weapons and was left himself voided. The Bal Shem Tov at that moment recognized and in fact only reiterated what was clearly evident to this sorcerer, this squire, that he could no longer, ever again, cause fear, destruction, cast spells, and so on. What is it that we begin to experience when at last we realize we rest in the place where the onion was, devoid of fear, devoid of desires, wants, needs, until we recognize that in this space there is something else. Could it possibly be then that we begin to recognize that all of the laws of existence work for the place where the onion has been, and more? Could it be what's your experience now in this place? What's your experience now? powerless. And yet, what is this staff? What does it represent for us?
It's the power that comes from nothing.
Yes.